Welcome to episode 7 of the Yieldseekers podcast. Time flies. We're back again this week with our regular team. Marc, also known as Mr. Cashflow, and Derk Van Dam, attorney and fund architect. I'm Rowan Rozemond, active in hedge funds and also involved in building funds. Joining us as well is Marc Wesselink, who specializes in building startup infrastructure, incubators, and the broader ecosystem around early-stage ventures. Derk and I are currently in Doha, meeting with various parties to discuss potential investments in the propositions we're offering. This is part of a broader trip through the Middle East, with several more countries on the agenda. Meanwhile, Marc is joining us from the Netherlands, if I'm not mistaken. This week, of course, Trump is once again stirring the pot, especially when it comes to tariffs. Tariffs have been rolled back to 10%, but China remains firm. China remains the main target, the kid to pick on, so to speak, at least from Trump's perspective. We'll dive into that in a moment. We're also covering urbanization, and we'll talk crypto, especially what's happening around Mantra. Plenty of big stories.
Absolutely. Plenty to unpack. What stands out to me most is the renewed debate sparked by the trade war, especially around commodities. It's a topic we've touched on before in this podcast, of course. There was, of course, a lot of attention on rare earth minerals a few weeks ago, particularly in relation to the Ukraine conflict. And now it seems the issue is resurfacing even more prominently because China has apparently announced, I just read this on several platforms, that basically said, if the US is going to hit us with trade tariffs, we'll stop exporting key minerals after June. According to several journalists, this could potentially trigger a major disruption. And honestly, I can imagine that being the case. Apparently, what I read earlier, I saw a graph on the BBC, shows that China controls about 90% of all rare earth minerals.
Of course, they've been heavily importing from Africa, where they've built entire train stations, railways, and even infrastructure around ports, all at a massive scale, where they just get stuff out of the ground. And yes, that all goes through Chinese ports. It's like Holland cacao market ownership. A lot of people know that, but almost 80% of the cacao beans go through the Amsterdam ports. And those all come from Africa, of course, but that just has, and China has that in that way also, with NATO already very important commodities.
This has been talked about for years. I spent some time in Africa myself, particularly in Rwanda, and we could already see years ago that the Chinese were everywhere, and not just for vacation.
No, they're playing a long game here. They know exactly how crucial raw materials are, and they also understand how much is in Africa, but it's almost inaccessible due to various reasons. Just look at Congo. What's buried there is truly mind-blowing, and yet no one can get to it. Until, of course, you just send 5,000 Chinese workers over there, build a turnkey house, and bring in a massive bulldozer.
Yeah, and often it plays out like this. They'll build the railways or a road, or even start with some vanity project that the local government wants. They rack up debts, which then become unsustainable because operations in Africa aren't exactly well managed. But let's leave it at that for now. That leads to a default moment, and then suddenly the collateral belongs to the Chinese. Yes, and then you end up with pieces of land, you end up with rail lines, you end up with all this infrastructure, and there's always some link that belongs to that country that makes them feel involved in that trade. But of course, there comes a time, just like actually happened in America, frankly, before they handed over the Panama Canal. There comes a time when such a country thinks of, yes, done, enough already, we feel we've more than repaid out of my country. You can see how America has dealt with this, for example, in the case of Panama, but also with a number of other major infrastructure projects.
The Suez Canal is, of course, managed similarly. The Chinese have taken a good look at the West and their practices. Unfortunately, they haven't executed it well there. You can see that China is making similar mistakes. This also results in considerable resistance. And of course, there's the same issue in Nigeria with the pipeline. So it's not like we have clean hands here or that the Chinese have invented something completely new. But yes, you do need to maintain relationships. Especially, I don't know if you're thinking broadly enough, but it's about a cooperative mindset. How can I ultimately benefit the local ecosystem as well? But they're not doing that. It's all about me, and the rest can just deal with it. That's really the issue here. This has happened many times before, and it doesn't work. So you have to actively try to help the country develop as well. And the Chinese are doing that to some extent.
Well, I think it really depends on the project and where they're involved, because there have been times when, especially in Africa, people were quite happy with the Chinese. On the other hand, discussions around this, as if that graph Roll just mentioned is accurate. They might have issues in some countries, but they have 90% of those resources. That's a fact.
You can see it even relatively close to us. Last week in Suriname, they say, when you go to the embassy in the Netherlands, they welcome you with "Welcome to Suriname." Yes, then I think it's quite easy. You don't have to take that flight, and my passport doesn't have to be brought along. But they had then also about, well, oil, of course, Suriname found about how much is going to Chinese companies, despite the fact that they have contracted BP to do the exploitation, while there is also a lot of expertise in the Netherlands and even Surinamese owners of Dutch companies. That part often gets glossed over because people don't really take the time to think it through. Like, hey, we actually need to involve those local players. And of course, it becomes even more complicated when countries want to remain independent from the Netherlands. Many of them have been looking to redefine or rebalance their relationship with the Netherlands for quite some time. The ambassador also spoke in those terms, saying we need to reevaluate the relationship. But on the other hand, that also leads to a kind of thinking like, oh, this relationship is a bit tricky, or at least it's taking up a lot of my attention. Maybe I should just let someone else handle it for now. And who's always there? China, of course. They've positioned themselves very cleverly, almost like dangling a carrot in the form of a bag of money in front of every world leader who needs to get something done. Here's the World Bank, or the alternative. And the World Bank has already shown us how those dynamics tend to play out.
Returning to the initial theme, if I am to trust those press releases, it appears that China has truly imposed restrictions on the export of raw materials to the United States. This could potentially lead to significant economic repercussions, in my opinion. Consequently, electronic products are likely to become considerably more expensive.
It's just like being back on the schoolyard, really. Shove once, shove twice. And in the end, the one who can throw the biggest punch right now is China. Because without raw materials, you're not going anywhere. So eventually they'll have no choice but to sit down at the table again, because truth is they can't live without each other.
And that's what I found so brilliant. First those tariffs, then saying we'll put them on hold, and then also say yes, but it doesn't actually apply that well to raw materials from China. Laptops and electronic devices, we let them pass without tariffs. I think, oh yeah, he still had a second thought that could be a problem. It's a nice game, but again, it's being done over the shoulders of all entrepreneurs.
What do you think of the statement that Trump is doing all this deliberately to bring the economy down, causing an economic dip so that interest rates fall and the U.S. national debt remains affordable?
That is a master plan, but I doubt that it is a master plan. I think there are very few bullies on the playground who have a master plan. It's just, yes, we need to do something, take action. And I don't think there is a big master plan behind it. It could just be a factual consequence. Absolutely, but it is possible. We all know that if you just take this kind of action against you, it can also be a well-known picture of Trump pissing out. He just comes right back in with a fan, the dollar, that's standing right now. And everybody's sitting, really looking at it like, yeah, guys, can I still trust the dollar in my trade? And the BRICS countries, they already have a strategy in motion. Behind the scenes, they're working on a digital currency. Their message is basically, hey, we're BRICS. We're doing our own thing. Now with Saudi Arabia and the UAE joining in, we could suddenly see the US dollar losing its status as the primary currency for global trade. And that would present the US with a very different kind of problem.
Well, then also those strategic reserves of China in dollar reserves suddenly come into a different light. Would that be a Chinese master plan at all? Because there are no people who know that, of course.
It's such a complicated game of chess. In a chess game, you can still think a little bit logically, but economics comes into it. The people with the emotion you're just really stupid to think that you can influence a global market with your own actions. That goes all back and forth like pinball.
I agree with you that it is very difficult to influence. I just don't quite agree with your statement about the dollar, because if you look at the dollar, it's been I'll throw it on the screen for a moment too. It's been pretty high, so to speak. I mean, we have a very long period here, the dollar index of just from the 2015. That whole Biden period, that dollar has basically been pretty strong relative to the Trump period before that. Just the problem that creates, if you just look at the data, including recent research from Rabobank, which has looked just at indeed that trade deficit, you can see that exploded during Biden. And then again, if we look at the years before that, 2019, 18, 17, where Trump was at the time, actually kind of flat, was slightly higher than before that, but that's more the overall trend. So that makes me understand where it comes from. So when you consider what constitutes that trade deficit, it is rising significantly. Strangely though, I may have taken that item off the screen a bit too fast. And for me, the key point is that the light isn't directed at China. Just check out this graph.
Put service in here as well, because one of the pulls also from Europe. There is made of, yes guys, you have the well-known 7. The Google, Facebook, who have global, a huge turnover, often don't get factored into this kind of trade deficit. But if you look at the sales of those 3, 4 companies, those are all being decentralized. That all does come together in the value creation in the US stock market. I do want to see what that does to the trade balance, because the trade balance doesn't take into account the big five, the big tech five. Apple, of course, does in some measures. If you look at the sales of Facebook, Amazon, I think Amazon has also fairly been processed to sort of Facebook and Google. Don't you think? I don't know, right? But we can add up in a moment, tens of billions. Rowan, you're better at that. Those kinds of figures are also factored into these trade balance deficits. In fact, I doubt that.
Well, there is indeed quite a discussion about that, because it's particularly about how do you calculate that trade deficit, because that's not an easy sum either. And so you can indeed go back to the fact to how important this really is. Are other factors not important? Because there is also a school of thought, much more indeed about the purchasing power of the people in the country where you live, much more about the happiness index, although that's also fairly arbitrary, that those are actually important measures of success economically as well than such a trade deficit or trade surplus. However, in the Netherlands, they often focus very much on, because of course we just have a very big trade industry too, with the port, with the airport, you name it. But at the end of the day, of course, it's still about that purchasing power. And then if you look at what the Americans' purchasing power is, it's extreme, especially compared to a country like China, everything in the Middle East, even like Europe. Actually, the American now has discounted travel to Europe. So from that point of view, you could say that consumers in America are not feeling that much of this. In fact, maybe some leisure elements that were more expensive before. I mean, every American wants to explore Europe, but that was just very pricey for them. And so you actually look at what momentum does Trump have now, because he has another year to make sure that the things through now that he wants to get through, because otherwise the midterms and then the weather can change completely and he can get a lot less done. And just looking at that climate there, I don't feel like the electorate that voted for Trump really think this is wrong, this is going in the wrong direction, or this is wrong. Honestly, there's a lot of talk by economists of they're going to feel that, they're going to feel that, we're going to push that a few months into the future. Those boats have to go to America and you name it, and only then are you going to feel that in an economy. The way Trump is doing it now is of I call everything and then I take some things out. That's exactly how we are doing with companies, how we are with startups. We try it all and then we take out what doesn't work. And that mentality we're just not used to on the world stage. And if we also look at the stock market, people are saying, yes, at least I listened to an economist this week and he very easily made the argument, yes, 4 trillion has evaporated in the stock market since Liberation Day. Well, that's 4 trillion is 10% of the economy. Because why is that 10% of the economy? Because companies turn an average profit of 10%. So I'll just do it times 10. And I thought that was very simple reasoning, that you then say, okay, 40 trillion has evaporated from the US economy. No, it has not evaporated. You see it's gone to gold. You see it's gone to other assets. It's not suddenly gone from the economy. It's a living ecosystem, which is just saying equities are a little bit more difficult. Because look at that stock market. Then that's a tool that looks forward, that actually looks at how profitable are companies. That's the whole discussion that people are having in the stock market. The Forex market, conversely, serves as a referendum regarding the strength of a specific nation. And when you examine the Forex market and the dollar, to revisit your initial inquiry, Wesselink, America has indeed been perceived as relatively strong in the last 4 years, and we are essentially reverting to the meridian rather than returning to a weaker dollar. We are merely going back to a standard period.
So that's more than normal. But on the other hand, because you see now how much doubt there is about America, but also with respect to their dollar, we could always rely on America, and now we can't. That's really going to do something. There were already signs that there was doubt about the dollar. Let's just choose another currency. Maybe a basket of some in the form of a stable coin. Those conversations are always there, and it could never be done. Before, it couldn't, but now suddenly it can. Now there are alternatives.
Yes, but even then, America is the one that then now says, I'll link that dollar to stable coins. I'm going to get that dollar into that stable coin industry because then I can control that again. And I think they're doing that very cleverly, and you don't get in there very quickly. So I just wonder, and then also if you look back, hey, in the 1917, and that we should get rid of from the gold standard, if you look back at that, at how the rest of the world reacted to that, it would have been the end of the dollar as well. So it's not that easy now.
It's also just a bit of a backlash against the trend that those BRICS countries are doing with such a digital currency. Trump just sees that happening. He thinks, well, I'm just going to turn my own digital currencies that are already on the market. I'm just going to put that dollar behind it. So then I'll keep that world reserve currency strong.
We're just reading tea leaves as well.
Yes, but still, that's partly what this podcast is for, of course, the comparison with 1970. Back then, America was still the undisputed leader in just about everything in this world. Technology, economic size, innovation, you name it. America used to be everything. However, that is just not the reality anymore. Even now, I can feel in our discussion the notion of Americans. They hold such significance that they continue to be the leading economy globally. That might be the case. We can analyze tea leaves deeply, but it is definitely not guaranteed that this will persist. And undoubtedly those nations, particularly China and Russia, along with possibly other countries in the distant East. Indeed, they are formidable players, whether in the BRICS framework or in another context, capable of voicing a significant counterpoint. I believe Trump recognizes this and disrupts it in a style reminiscent of New York real estate to check if he can manage to turn the tides. But will that be successful? Honestly, I'm not quite sure about that, whether that is indeed the case. And we just talked about the dollar's role. I also read a lot about dollarization around the world. I agree with what was just mentioned. It's not a reality yet, and there is no BRICS currency or anything of that sort. However, it could happen very quickly. These are issues we should consider, but I think we already have the best perspective on it.
I think it is nice to see. I don't see America for the long term as the world power at all, but rather as a country that is still trying in the same old way to get something done that hasn't worked for a long time. They don't want to cooperate. That's really the whole story. They want to be the world power, and the rest of the world wants to cooperate. So the countries that are going to cooperate best with each other, they're going to collectively become the world power.
That is, of course, from each other. I think it's more about China and America. China, of course, is one of the oldest civilizations, which has also evolved extremely much. I don't know which is the worst. I don't have an opinion on that.
Russia is just like Canada, actually an additional economy of world power. US is Russia, in my opinion, an additional market for China. They are clearly clustering. Somebody high up in the CCP has said yes, we think the relationship with Russia is very important, and that relationship remains. And after, of course, some Chinese were tried, yes, were arrested in the war in Ukraine, and were put in front of the camera like, look, you have to do something with China. I thought the timing of it was very remarkable, to put it simply. Therefore, I also question how true that really is, since there are 2 soldiers, or similar individuals, who have been apprehended. There aren't too many of them at this point.
That was about North Korea, right?
Yes, and the Koreans.
China and North Korea are involved. China has not sent people to Russia, but North Korea has.
No, there should be 2 Chinese found by now, but I really don't know as I wasn't there.
Koreans are more indeed, but anyway, special moment. But of course, it's just a proxy war for a very different higher purpose where people are playing chess.
It's also undoubtedly American intelligence, you see. People with military suits walking around Ukraine.
Absolutely. Probably only one person got arrested, and I'm sure Chinese state media shaped the narrative. It's clearly one-sided. I always say, history is written by the winners. They decide what gets remembered. The losers usually have little say in how history is recorded.
There are plenty of examples of that.
Yes, many. So yes, that's also always tricky about looking back also for such an economy, for such an economic view of the past. It was written by those who benefited from it and not so much by those who suffered. And now we do live in a different world than before. So there are more storylines possible and there is more to follow. It's all much faster, of course, much more information, much more notations of facts that you can fall back on. And I think that's still the tricky thing to those theories of how were world powers in the past and how are they now. Of course, we just have a lot more people in the world. There is also possibility to run bipolar, have a world power bipolar actually coexist. But yes, space hasn't become more, so it does make it a smaller Earth, and that's just going to chafe more.
Really is going to happen. But I thought that it almost wasn't bad that we with a front group already a my feeling say Trump is trial and error, whereas you said something like that before with respect to what you do with startups. Also, just trying to see what happens. Let's see how it turns out. Just on the global economic front, I still think it's all kinds of things going on at a startup level. Exciting. You also see, again, what strikes me so much, that other political leaders then deal with it next, and that everybody is now back thickening their own hearts. I saw that Meloni of Italy is now also traveling to Washington again, to more or less literally throw her feminine charms into battle with the US government there. I am curious to see how that will play out on behalf of the EU, but I think it's mainly about Italian interests anyway. You would think so. But that is, of course, the EU says, no, we do have a problem with that again. The European, no. But then the European Commission says it's not wise at all because it plays us apart as Europe, but they do. Yes, I read that Musk had already said that she is as beautiful on the inside as it is on the outside. And then you get these kinds of not very professional statements from people like this. Unbelievable. These are crazy times, you know. As far as that goes.
Yes, but now we can also follow everything much more closely.
I find it so beautiful that everything is visible. I always felt that with previous administrations, everything happened behind closed doors. Yes, Trump just puts everything out in the open. He shows everything. He's really a social media president.
And Musk too. Let's go.
They just reveal what's always been going on behind the curtain, only now it's right in your face. The best illusionists don't hide things. They perform them in plain sight. It demands a sharp eye. We've mentioned it before. Everything that happens here is meant to draw attention away from what's happening there. I always wonder, what's really going on over there? And more importantly, what's the end game behind the distraction we're being shown?
As a result, you have all that violence happening over there and a Maloney who, after all, is going to Washington. The news is that the Dutch government will, in any case, not take measures for the companies that have been affected.
No, they are hoping for the entrepreneurship of the Dutch themselves, but they do not intend to the billions in support I saw in other countries. For example, in the UK, where they were already handing out 20 billion in aid for all the fleeing entrepreneurs who are already fleeing to the UK anyway. Last year, more than 10,000 millionaires left there, and that hasn't stopped, I can tell you, as of January 1st. So they are quite at their wits' end when it comes to these tariffs. But the Netherlands, they do not foresee any need for action.
No. Now, I must say, in the UK, this millionaire migration, so to speak, is related to the property tax, which was naturally introduced there and pretty intense. I mean, a lot of millionaires and billionaires are just going back home, so to speak. So they come back where we are now in Qatar and invest here again or in other countries here in the Middle East. Africa, there were, of course, also a lot.
A lot of African entrepreneurs all there. And now you see a lot of repatriates coming back.
Yes, of course, the real estate, but also what was very important for those entrepreneurs is that they are going to impose extra taxes on the transfer of businesses, so sale and transfer. I believe there was a significant doubling of the tax levy on that. So even if you want to transfer a business to your children or to a staff member, so you want to return to your country and you want to give your CEO shares, I believe that would be taxed 2.5 times compared to how it was in the years or 22.
Yes, but that goes to the same standard as here in the Netherlands.
Yes, the percentages are the same.
Well, there is also a very important thing, I think. Before Brexit, almost 70% of European startups started their business in the UK. Eastern Europe, Southern Europe. I went to London to startup events. Almost 70% of the entrepreneurs I spoke to were not from the UK, but from Eastern or Southern Europe. For various reasons, but mainly it's the market incorporation of the UK. Many of those people don't do it anymore. But they are now increasingly going to the Netherlands. Dutch BCs are also being used quite a lot. But yes, US Delaware, they are going much more on a global scale. There are even Dutch entrepreneurs like Job from Remote who say, yes, I advise startups to incorporate their business in America. In Delaware, you can just set up a company online, click, 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 and you're instantly a global company. I think that definitely played a role in the massive exodus of wealthy individuals, whether on paper or in reality, out of the UK. We're also seeing the repatriation of many African entrepreneurs. One of our portfolio companies is part of one of Africa's largest neobanks. It used to be a UK limited company, but it's now being moved into an EDGN structure. So I believe that data also plays a key role in all of this.
It does relate to what I hear. I myself have been out of London a few times recently. Well, there you don't see much difference. But what I hear from people who drive through the English countryside and visit the smaller towns, well, the medium-sized cities, I don't hear pleasant stories about the prosperity and how things are going in that country. Of course, it's also London.
London, everything. London is still the world capital, of course. An incredible amount of money still flows through London. But the rest of England, I don't know if you've ever spent a few days traveling around Liverpool, Manchester, in that area, then you don't really feel very cheerful when you go outside the city centers.
No, the differences between the city center and the outskirts are really big.
You can already notice it on your phone, right? I suddenly just have, when you're past the ring road, my 5G just stops. Then I immediately go back to 3G.
But well, that's also the case in Germany. If you ever go from Germany to Belgium, you're really just on that you almost continuously lose connection.
Not only is that coverage very poor, but also Germany is right there. I just drove all the way through Germany several times to that exercise last week. That doesn't look very good either. Everything is mossy, rusty, and green, and it all looks poorly maintained. Also, because until recently there was still a bit of a contrast between the old West Germany and the former GDR, where in the GDR everything was polished up as if newly set up. Well, not much is happening with that either. I don't find it all very... The contrast with the Netherlands and the rest of Europe is really quite significant in my view. The Netherlands, well, the Dutch provinces, and it all actually looks quite neat, but honestly...
Where you focus your attention, that grows, and if you all migrate to such a city, yes, then that leads to attention being there, capital being there, and people being there for maintenance. That means you indeed just neglect the hinterland, and you see this happening all over the world. And that is quite concerning because it's the same in America, it's the same in Africa, it's the same in Asia. So it's just a very big trend in humanity. And of course, it's often talked about, is it really good? Should we all be sitting on one big concrete mountain, or should we be more spread out? I still have the idea that in terms of resources, it doesn't make much difference.
No, but, well, the autonomous car is coming. So you just sit back, do a bit, and the car takes you an hour and a half outside the city. So there, yes, innovation saves the world.
Why? If you're just driven around in a camper for 8 hours through the city, then you've also slept. Why would you need to drive out of a city?
Yes, that's fine. However, ultimately, I did leave the city as well. I really enjoy waking up sometimes to the sound of quacking ducks rather than the
Yes,
blaring
true.
of a police
But aren't
siren.
we the exception? I often wonder.
I live in the city. Yes, no, I lived in the city, right in the center of Utrecht for 25 years, and I enjoyed it a lot. But at some point, the city became so busy and just noisy. Now, I wake up in the morning to the sound of ducks instead of sirens. I think the reason why many people live in the city is often work-related. And I think that the distance between, hopefully, home and work is becoming less and less, either through autonomous driving or through collaboration online. I think it is better to utilize all of the Netherlands instead of just Amsterdam. But this is quite a Dutch perspective, isn't it? The Netherlands is Tokyo. The distance between Utrecht and Amsterdam. In London, that's the same city. Then I just drive along a stretch of highway. Then I only see buildings on the right side, a park. And then suddenly I'm in a different neighborhood in London. In our case, that's Amsterdam and Utrecht. Because yes, they naturally, from that history with city rights, they will never, ever in their entire lives have a travel district in The Hague and Rotterdam. Yes? That's one city.
Never, never, ever. You're right. Only what strikes me in the rest of Europe. Look, in the Netherlands, if you pass Amersfoort, it's still generally neat, well maintained. Drive through Belgium.
I fully agree with you. It has often caught my attention that the Dutch are very neat when it comes to tidying their gardens. You can take a grand journey across America, but not on the interstates. Rather, you should genuinely travel through the towns. Hello, hello, hello. You're really getting to that point. It's definitely something, in my opinion.
Yes, and I think, look, with America, you could still say, well, it was maybe always a bit like that, though. But Europe, I remember from my youth, and I'm getting older, as everyone knows, even in France, even in Belgium, everything was neat, tidy, it all looked very similar. Yes, there was definitely a certain level of prosperity across Western Europe, at least, and I believe that's just not the case anymore. A good friend of mine has a little house in northern France, not far from the Netherlands. It's a beautiful spot, so close, you can just head there easily, with a stunning environment. But all the villages there, they're really empty. No one lives there anymore. Well, a few farmers who maintain the lands. And beyond that, it's just, and not just one or two villages, right? No, entire regions that are completely depopulated. No one lives there anymore. You see that in Italy too. Last year, I visited a village near Naples where once a year the population returns to that village like a kind of reunion. Then it's very lively, the whole population is there. The rest of the year, no one. Completely empty.
No, there are villages you can buy for $1.
You can buy a house there for €1,000. A big house, but you must commit to living in it for at least part of the year.
I have to leave you a bit earlier. I need to make a visit to the hospital. In December, I had a severe infection, so I need to go for a checkup. Therefore, I will be leaving you. I don't want to take you along in the car again, and I'll see you again next week.
That trend in Europe, I find it quite alarming. Honestly, it serves as a signal. Aside from the geopolitical comparisons we just made with China, America, Russia, proxy wars, and similar issues. This is indeed what might be the driving force behind everything. But if a continent like Western Europe, which has always been a sort of cradle of civilization and prosperity, is falling apart like this, except maybe for the large cities, I really don't know. I'm also looking at Rowan. We sometimes have internal discussions about whether we should still remain here, because we both happen to be in Qatar now. Yes, there's a different atmosphere there, so to speak, and that's something I'm not quite sure about yet either.
I also think that if you look at the cities in Europe, there's still quite a bit going on. I do have the idea that the cities are doing well, so to speak, also economically in themselves. Yes, it's kind of a feeling of guilt when you drive through Europe. I think that there, as Marc said, on a technological level, it can yield a lot. So for example, in Africa, you've seen that if they can generate power remotely, they tend to return more to their original places, and that they don't start populating certain water wells and whatnot more densely. In that regard, I anticipate that as technology enables living anywhere, which we witnessed during the COVID pandemic, individuals will increasingly relocate from urban areas. They will likely work more from home and pursue greater tranquility. Yet, there exists a constant tension between urbanization and the quest for peace, clean air, freedom, and well-being. I think this will continue to be a dilemma for many.
I also think it's a wave movement, long wave movements, because it really takes years. It also has many economic elements. I mean, if a city becomes too expensive, people move away. Then the city becomes a bit cheaper and people move back in. So there's also a very important economic tension in that consideration. And that Hugo de Jonge has, of course, tried to do that artificially. It just goes to show that you should never try to do anything artificially because it always has other side effects. It always leads to something you don't want or another effect because it wasn't A, B. It was A, B, C, and the whole alphabet of options that were available. You didn't foresee 90% of those. So yes, but yes, we don't know. We only know that we as humans do it this way, and that might be a nice little segue now that we might finally all be able to go to planet K2-18b, an exoplanet discovered by scientists that shows the molecules methane, CO, and other substances that can really only be associated with life, and maybe very primitive life, but still life. That is quite a discovery, and yes, then maybe we shouldn't all go to Mars, but we should go to this still somewhat critically named planet.
It sounds very nice, but I haven't quite seen how far that planet is from us. I think that could be a challenge to get there someday. They are interesting leaps of thought, of course. I am somewhat skeptical about it.
I believe it's 125 million light years, so there's still a technical issue to get there. But hey, maybe we have a planet where we can observe how it should be done. And I think that's a bit of the moral of the story, that we are all just humanity trying to make the best of it together. I don't believe that there is ultimately another country that has such bad intentions for itself or acts out of malice. It acts from first principles too, which is we are stuck, we need to do something, and that's why we start a war. Only that war, which is only after various facets we have already discussed earlier in this podcast, is that a war is essentially a buildup of cornering another who ultimately feels that the only thing left to do is to improve our position through bloodshed. It never really stems from just today, let's invade the neighbors. You don't do that. Every person, every population is basically just concerned with basic needs, essentially Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Then only when that is threatened do people resort to fighting. There is no example of a different approach. Yes, you could say a dictator's show of power, but even they have the idea that perhaps higher up the pyramid, they are not being served to their satisfaction.
Well, there are, of course, examples. It happened in Nazi Germany. That is quite a whole. This reasoning was indeed laid down there by the gentleman. How pure that was, I do not know.
But weren't those side effects of that war terrible side effects? But initially, if we look at what the Second World War arose from, then it was actually economic problems in Germany that led to a certain course of events.
Yes, but also complete misuse of this situation by a certain clique. Now that the war is further behind us, you increasingly see analytical reflections on what actually caused that war. Of course, there is a nuance behind that. That's always the case but I still maintain that primarily a number of criminals came to power there. Why they did it, I still do not know, but that cannot be justified, you know.
No, that cannot be justified, and I absolutely do not mean that. What I do want to say is that it's always action-reaction, no matter how crazy. Ultimately, at least that's how I see the world. It's molecule meets molecule, and that pushes the next molecule, which is why the weather is always so unpredictable. It's because you can never track all those molecules, but that's how everything in our system works. So it's action-reaction, energy.
I also saw a few reports in the press about the Mantra token.
Yes, there has been a massive price drop at Mantra, from $6 to below 50 cents. So that's really a 90% loss. Well, that certainly doesn't do the reputation of such a company any good. And there were rumors that that was orchestrated from within. In crypto terms, they call that a rug pull. It means the rug is pulled out from under all the investors. He received an Ask Me Anything session, and the CEO, John Mullen, stated there that this is absolutely not the case, and that they are working on a recovery plan. It's just that it's still in the early stages. That was basically the story of the article. But yes, what they really wanted to know was what was actually going on and whether there was any foul play involved or not. So in general, crypto doesn't have the best reputation when it comes to things being done properly. The idea is often that the owner of such a crypto startup primarily wants to enrich themselves through token generation. Then nothing is built or they stop building at some point once they've made money. This one wants to show that he is indeed working hard to set this right. So they are working on a recovery plan, a fund of 109 million that should promote the recovery and growth of the ecosystem. I think they want to burn tokens that are still in the market, something you see more often.
Fewer tokens. Apply the money yourself, and then the token should go up. That's the idea. When I look at the whole story, this is, in my opinion, Well, I don't know if you know people who lost money with it. I haven't myself. I'm not involved in these kinds of investments. I would also not recommend anyone to get involved with initial coin offerings. You really need to have a good understanding of that market, and you need to be fully immersed in it. At the end of the day, this is, of course, a mega risk, because ultimately, if you manage to establish a good funding culture for entrepreneurs with crypto, where one can easily and quite quickly fund a company, now often through crowdfunding has become ridiculously expensive. You end up paying something like 12% to a company that puts it on a website, making you think, well, we could have done that ourselves, because the traffic afterwards is often not there. Now, many of those platforms have also become regulated. So crowdfunding platforms have essentially become a kind of mini banks, where they do peer-to-peer lending instead of leveraging the deposited money. Break time. Yes, crypto is somewhat replacing crowdfunding, and crowdfunding is shifting towards the small loans that used to come from the bank, and the bank has stopped giving loans to small entrepreneurs and is focusing on larger projects. And even there, you see that banks actually want to get out, because banks no longer have a purpose. They don't know what to do anymore. Break time. They have zero vision, zero focus on where it should go. There is also room in the market, but it's just a very difficult market to have innovation in because of those permits. And yes, we are invested in a number of those projects that are trying to really bring about change there, because that market is ready for disruption. But these kinds of elements just remind me of the first crowdfunding platforms that went bankrupt, leaving investors with, yes, you have a contract, but through a foundation. That foundation is now with the trustee or directly, and no support. Companies succeed and they fail, and more fail than succeed. If we look at the figures from every chamber of commerce in the world, then 95% is gone after 5 years. Only 5% make it, and that's also why you should give an entrepreneur space to enjoy the income when successful, to enjoy the success, because he takes a huge risk. I mean, it starts at that moment, he or she, and there's a 5% chance that succeeds. Any rational person would think, well, I might as well do something else, because if I continue for 2 years, and many also quit too early, many throw in the towel after a year or so. You really need perseverance if you want to start a business. And it just takes years, and then it will come to fruition. It's just a shame that there's a huge jealousy about the success that follows, because it's not an overnight success. It's always an overnight success, 5 years in the making. Nobody wants to wade through that mud just to come out on the other side. Everyone wants to be immediately immersed in the world of social media we live in, to be right there on the other side, because that's how the world looks from that screen where they are lured in by American social media magnates, and now also China, of course, with Binance. But yes, to then bring it back to such a coin and say, oh, it's all scary, all dangerous, and crypto. No, these are the withdrawals of an industry that is developing. Whether you want to invest in it, I myself do not, but there are many who do, and I applaud them, because that is innovation. I choose other places to achieve that innovation, but that is innovation. So money needs to go in, money is burned, and ultimately that's what we talk about we do too little of that in Europe. And the only thing we do in Europe, again, about this story, is like, oh, everyone see how badly it's going wrong, see how scary it all is, and at the same time, the European Central Bank is introducing a stable coin. So what are we talking about?
What I find so interesting is that people react very strongly to these kinds of events, and as a result, so much money is just pulled out of the market. What we often forget is that these are just companies. They are simply entrepreneurs setting up a business. The crypto world is really still just a drop in the ocean of the world's entrepreneurship. It's so small. A few years of those startups were helped. If you just look inside those ecosystems and those companies and who they are in contact, it's so small and amateurish compared to a VC world or a private equity world. Relatively so little money there that it also makes sense that 90%, 25% don't make it. They are massively opposed because they all just wander around in relatively small circles. For example, such a mantra that tries to build something truly a vision for the future. The mantra is mainly about real-world assets. They want real assets to combine with the actual online companies. In crypto, you often see that the coins, it's just air. In a computer, just like with our central banks, a number is simply entered, and there's nothing underneath. That's basically what is the case with many cryptocurrencies, because everything they want to build with the money they plan to raise isn't there yet. And then they say, there's no value underneath. No, that still needs to be built. And many of those, in quotation marks, are more like gold diggers. They do such an IPO or ICO and take half the money with them. And they think, yes, my work is done because I've already got the money. So often nothing is really built. Or yes, they are in the real 25% who do try to build something, but just can't manage. They simply don't have the capabilities. But I always find it such a shame when parties like Mantra are immediately labeled as a scam. The future will have to show if that is truly the case. As I saw it, they were all explainable activities. The panic arose because there were large amounts of that coin being moved from one wallet to another in Wales. The CEO was able to explain all of that. So, to take this as an example, You see it very often in the crypto world, especially when the prices have dropped a bit. Then there is always some sort of rug pull talk, or a company is always singled out that doesn't make it, or that just shows more extreme fluctuations. And that immediately becomes a big hype in the media.
It just shows how easy it is to judge and express all sorts of opinions.
What I find so interesting is that today it has risen by 25% again. Then that man explained how it works, and suddenly we trust it a little more.
Measuring is knowing, and a phone call often solves a lot.
If you have a position of 100 and it goes down by 50%, then you need 100% to get back to the original position, so 25 more, so that's hardly anything, but indeed,
I think it went from 50 to 60 cents.
We are not in the Middle East for nothing, of course. We are yield seeking. I would say thank you for your attention, and until the next podcast.
Thank you.